Welcome to McGill Minute. I'm Joel Storrow, Senior Principal here at McGill. Thanks for joining us for this three-part series. Utility systems across the nation are greatly being impacted by the ripple effects of COVID-19, including lost revenues, reduced staffing, and necessitated changes to their capital planning. It has been quoted by the author and thought leader Peter Drucker that the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic. I was speaking with a treatment plant operator for a small town we work with just this morning, and he was wanting to brainstorm some staffing needs that he has at the treatment plant. And so I'm hoping that a lot of the content in today's podcast, the ones to come, will definitely help everyone listening out there with certain challenges that they may face. In this three-part series, we're going to evaluate our own logic, getting back to Peter Drucker there, explore the impacts on utility systems and steps communities may take to move ahead during these uncertain times. Our guest speakers for this series bring over 45 years of collective experience. Number one, RJ has over 14 years of experience here at McGill. He is a dedicated and talented designer who has demonstrated his skills on a wide range of projects, including utility coordination, wastewater collection systems, and water distribution. Second, Dale Sheepers. Dale has over 30 years of hands-on municipal experience and 24 years managing public infrastructure and services in 2 states, serving communities ranging in population from just over 3,000 to 78,000. Dale has extensive experience with creating and managing budgets, capital planning, engineering design and construction, administration, finance, asset management, rate analysis, and rate setting. In a word, he's a Mr. Do-It-All. Having worked with both RJ and Dale and knowing how committed they are in our industry, I'm excited to speak to both of them as a part of this series. In this first part, you will be hearing from RJ. RJ, let me jump in and ask you what you are seeing in terms of specific ways that utility systems are being affected by COVID.
Sure. Thank you, Joel. It's a pleasure to be with you today and talk a little bit about what we're seeing clients of ours encounter. Being a firm that does a good bit of work in North Carolina, the primary impact that we've seen folks run into is the executive order from Governor Cooper that restricted cutoffs for utility systems because of COVID situation on customers. And so that's been a number one paramount concern for many of our clients in trying to estimate how much revenue loss they're going to have to realize, even though some of that revenue may be recovered at some point. In the relatively near future, there are still a lot of uncertainties with that. And there's certainly some amount of those funds that are currently building in arrears that they may never see at all. So folks are really trying to position themselves to minimize those strains on their local government and their utility system. Just to put a couple of numbers to that idea, the minor increases in residential consumption and revenue for some households pale in comparison to the declines that they're seeing in commercial revenues as commercial accounts and industrial accounts have to slow down and even shut down in some cases. And you factor in the matter that a lot of our systems that we're talking to see numbers around 15 to 20% of folks who just are not paying residential bills at all because of that executive order from the governor. But we're all hopeful that with some businesses reopening and conditions improving in the not too distant future, we hope that the demands will pick back up and the revenues will follow right along with that. But, suspension of those cutoffs, those late fees and penalties, and the fact that it's going to take maybe 6 months for some folks to get back on a payment plan and get caught back up is definitely going to be a real challenge for our utility system clients and keeping their cash flow moving.
Here's hoping they can recover sooner rather than later. And with the utility, there's a lot of fixed costs involved with just operating and maintaining the system. What impacts are you seeing on that front with O&M? It makes me wonder how these utilities can stay operational and in compliance if revenues continue to drop. And with the potential reductions in staffing and funding for maintenance, Do you have concerns about regulatory compliance?
In some cases, certainly, depending upon the situation and the staff that may be impacted directly, in particular at your treatment plants, that could be the first place that you do realize some of those impacts. But the state and the EPA issue permits and they expect full compliance through any type of emergency situation. And COVID is one that we don't think gets an exception at this point. So those utility systems are often making special efforts to track all of their normal records and then maybe a few extra saved data, and then staff their plants and their collections and distribution systems in such a way that they minimize exposure. When a small town of 4,000 or 5,000 customers has a water plant that's somewhere in the 8 to 10 million gallon per day range, that system builds into a overall economy of scale where they have, in a lot of cases, only 2 shifts of operators, and so that's not many operators to run a plant like that. So if they have any kind of cross-contamination or outbreak within those staffs, that could be a big hindrance for them in a very short amount of time. And so, it's also going to be important for utilities of that size to keep good records, to utilize system maps, or if at all possible, they don't have maps, begin creating some more mapping as they look at ways to try to put knowledge onto paper and not be so completely dependent on staff memory and empirical knowledge. So that's one thing that we've seen people, continuing to do over the last couple of years with more of an asset management and asset inventory and assessment mindset, but one that would definitely pay dividends in a time of crisis where staff aren't always available as well. We've also found, resources like the AWWA and rural water, those folks like that are helpful for our clients, especially the smaller clients in North Carolina, with some of those resiliency planning, preparedness, and helping in operational situations like this. So the folks are really reaching out to a lot of those avenues anywhere that they can.
RJ, those are really good suggestions. You mentioned earlier that there's a lot of uncertainty on the potential loss of revenue in these systems. Do you have any specific suggestions on how communities might get a handle on this?
Sure. Budgets are full of uncertainties. Every budget year, there's a reason that budget season is so hectic for public entities, public utility systems in particular, because there's always some level of uncertainty. And the fact that those normal uncertainties are now compounded by these new COVID concerns in this next fiscal year. We're hearing solutions across the board, from using reserves that are saved up for those that have them, to changing staffing to make staffing efforts a little more efficient. I've also heard of folks using newer loans to try to keep them afloat, in some cases, hopefully low interest. We've also seen a number of folks looking at re-examining their rates and trying to anticipate some of that revenue loss they won't be able to collect in volume, but trying to collect in the rate itself, the unit rate. And then we've also had folks, checking in regularly, trying to keep a pulse on what's coming down the pipe from the federal level, state level funding programs, trying to do anything that they can to manage that process. But in the short term too, managers and utility directors alike are tracking those revenues closely best they can. And, folks with AMI capabilities or maybe even AMR capabilities, but a little more advanced billing systems, hopefully are realizing the benefit of being able to do that in more real time and with less effort for their costs. But they are in regular communication with their commercial customers as well, trying to understand better when those commercial and industrial users plan to return to normal operations, normal usage patterns. And then they also are looking at forecasting maybe in different terms than they normally would, maybe a mid-year budget review, mid-year revenue review, and making plans to adjust their annual budget as necessary. And I think that's been something we've heard a lot about in the utility systems budgets for the enterprise funds, but that's also something we've heard kicked around a number of times for different towns' general funds. So it's one of those type things that you budget based on a plan and your best hope and your best guess for some unknown circumstances, but you've got to operate your system in such a manner that it's viable, both short term and long term. And so, we think about that long-term approach then, and folks are considering revisiting their capital improvements plans, their rate studies, and exploring, more opportunities for grant funding in the hopes that maybe there's some stimulus funds coming that would result in grant funding or some low interest money to accomplish projects that, otherwise may have been taxing reserves or requiring more substantial rate increases. So folks are definitely looking at revisiting those plans and prioritizing what's most critical to them. And then again, trying to position themselves in such a way that they can leverage their situation as best possible for their ratepayers.
Well, that's all good stuff, RJ. Let's spend some more time on the capital improvements plans or CIPs. I know McGill has over 36 years of experience developing and managing CIPs for hundreds of municipal utilities across a number of states. Why are CIPs so important?
The CIP becomes a really important tool because that's the spot where you have managers and utility directors and the operations staff able to implement their greatest influence over the utility system's long-term health, really, and the long-term revenue requirements. I mean, how else can you control the revenue needs better than the way you plan and schedule improvements projects? And we know all systems have needs for improvements. That's part of renewing a system and ensuring the long-term, reliable utility system. That improvements plan really helps utility systems to realize those objectives and the projects that they implement long-term so that they can ensure that. And that capital improvements planning process is one that we've seen really pay dividends for a number of clients up until, COVID, and will do so continuing, beyond COVID's 2020 impact. That plan also ultimately becomes the place where managers and utility directors set their rates and determine that revenue that they are going to ask ratepayers to provide through the usage of their system. And in some cases, folks are fortunate enough to see, new customers coming in, new growth, and so new revenue streams. And others, they're realizing that rate increase to continue to fund their long-term objectives. Rehabilitation and replacement schedules are definitely critical to developing a financial model that puts a system in good position for long-term health and helps keep those rate adjustments as steady and expected as they can be for customers in the long term. And so, these capital improvements plans also do lend themselves to use in situations where outside money is available. And who doesn't like spending somebody else's money, like spending free money, so to speak? And one way that we see clients get themselves in the good position for low interest or zero interest or even grant dollars is by having a capital improvements plan that's well thought out, that identifies your needs and being ready to capitalize on those when opportunities arise from, sources like a stimulus package from the federal level. And so that's one of those things that communities who are successfully managing their outside dollars and outside, grant revenue type resources have positioned themselves well in the past. But we think there are a number of clients that are really working hard to get more projects on those CIPs, even ready to the point where they could be deemed shovel ready and really short to implement, moving to a bidding and construction phase step. This is one of those things where we're telling folks, now's the time to think about revising or revisiting your CIP. If you have one that may have a little bit of dust on it, pick it up, reprioritize, and identify, some of those projects that you have to have and can't delay just because revenue may change a little bit. And there may be some other projects that you look at on that plan that over time have changed as well, and now don't seem to be so critical, in light of the current situation. And that may free up money in the capital improvements plan to direct those funds elsewhere. And that's something that we're looking at with folks also. Finally, along those lines, it would be an opportune time to take a look at that capital projects list. Also look at the opportunities that you may need to capitalize on. Talk about those kinds of things with LGC, North Carolina here. That'd be the agency to make sure your system is in as healthy a position as it can be should a good opportunity come along, because we know any of those large size projects LGC is going to take interest in. That's going to be one of those steps that you want to be ahead of as best you can be, so that you don't see a good opportunity pass you by just because you're over leveraged in one area or another. And so, looking at those opportunities and some possibilities of refinancing or financing the first time out certain projects that, maybe you would have performed with cash or cash reserves, looking at being creative with how you add debt even oftentimes can help significantly with cash flow in times like these.
Thank you, RJ. You used the word opportunities frequently during our discussion. I couldn't agree more that even though communities are faced with some challenging times, this is the perfect time to plan, forecast, and reprioritize. McGill is here to assist doing just that. As we close the first part of our series, I'd like to remind our listeners to tune in to parts 2 and 3 at podcast.mcgillassociates.com as we dive further into rate studies and grant funding. If you have any questions about McGill, be sure to reach out to us at info@mcgillassociates.com or check out our website, mcgillassociates.com.